Welcome to the second event in the Max Weber Foundation Web Forum series on the digital transformation, hosted by the German Institute for Japanese Studies, DHA. Today's topic is governance in the digital age, and we have the opportunity to hear insights from three experts looking at this topic from three different angles. I am Harald KÜMMERLE, Senior Research Fellow focusing on the digital transformation, which is a research focus at our institute since 2019. I will moderate this event. Let me first introduce our three speakers very shortly, and then say something about the structure of this event before giving a bit of context on the topic. Our three speakers are Kaori HAYASHI from the University of Tokyo, Melike ŞAHINOL from the Orient Institute in Istanbul, and Franz WALDENBERGER, director of the German Institute for Japanese Studies. After the individual talks, we have the opportunity to hear on short reactions to each other's talks. This gives a good start for the discussion with the audience. As we have 2 hours in total, there is plenty of time for this, for the discussion afterwards. Feel free to pose your questions through the Zoom chat function already before this. In the section for the discussion, I will pick up the questions in this segment. Today's topic is governance in the digital age, as I said, and the viewpoints of our speakers are very diverse. But when I read the title again today, I was reminded of a well-known article in the Harvard Law Review from 2018 entitled "The New Governors." Its main argument sounds a bit intimidating. The article argues that the platforms Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube are the new governors of the public, responsible for shaping and allowing the digital and democratic culture. But its conclusion is not as pessimistic as it may sound. Although they have little direct accountability to their users, the platforms do in fact reflect expectations of their users through various pressures, economic or otherwise. So let's be a bit more optimistic and hear from our three experts on governance in the digital age. Let me now introduce our first speaker, Kaori HAYASHI. She is professor of media and journalism studies at the Graduate School of Interdisciplinary Information Studies at the University of Tokyo. Kaori is also executive vice president of the University of Tokyo, in charge of global and diversity affairs, and director of the BAI Global Forum, which was set up within the Institute for AI and Beyond. Today's talk is titled "Towards a Gender Equal Society in the AI Era, a Distant Goal for Japan." Kaori, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. My name is Kaori HAYASHI, and as introduced, I am professor of media and journalism studies at the University of Tokyo, as well as executive vice president of University of Tokyo, which then I oversee the diversity and global affairs. So, and my theme is also related to the diversity, the realization of diversity in Japanese society. So let me just share the slides. So here. So the title of my presentation is "Toward the Gender Equal Society in the AI Era, which may be a distant goal for Japan." Now, we have to pose a question: what is wrong with the AI? Concerning what is the problem with AI and gender? So it has been always talked that AI is pursuing the data capitalism and also overcome or dominate the way of life, the way of our lives. So digital technology has been penetrating very deeply into our lives. And also data have been accumulated and used as big data that are fed for AI. And some people like Yuval Noah Harari says that AI is just like a prophet. So the AI predict our futures. And also data are used for the prediction of the future behavior. That's what Shoshana Zuboff said. And people, and Zuboff also said that it is a surveillance capitalism, and data that we all share are now like the new oil. So, and we want to put these issues and themes into the Japanese context. And I want to focus on the gender issues as well as the AI technologies. First, about gender issue. Let's look at the left column of my slide. And I brought this questionnaire or survey from the spring 2019 Global Attitude Surveys. And it's about the questions about gender. And the first question is, do you think it is very important that women have the same rights as men in your country? And the respondents in the UK said 92% of the respondents in the UK said yes. Whereas, for example, in Japan, only 63% respondents said yes. For example, in the next question, do you think it is likely that women in your country will eventually have the same rights as men? 81% in the UK said yes, whereas only 66% in Japan said yes. And let's look at the right column about the questions about the AI technology. It's from the International Science Survey in 2019 to 2020. And the first question is, do you think the development of AI has mostly been a good thing for society? And people in Japan said 65% of the respondents in Japan said yes, whereas less than half of the respondents either in US, Germany, and UK said yes. The next question, do you think using robots to automate many jobs humans have done in the past has mostly been a good thing for society? And 68% of the respondents in Japan said yes, whereas also less than 50% in other 3 countries said yes. So in sum, Japan ranked the lowest in the survey on the gender equality, whereas Japan ranked the highest in the survey of positive public views of the AI's impact on society. So here we can pose a question: how do Japanese think about the gender issues related to AI? So let's look at further about the gender and AI. But it's been an issue in the AI technology around the globe that, for example, here in the journal Nature, they problematized AI as sexist and racist. So they proposed their proposal, it's time to make it fair. Now, in our country, for example, we have this Japanese Society for Artificial Intelligence. The left-hand cover is their first journal issue, which is quite a plain cover that is typical for the academic journal. But in 2014, they renewed their journal in order to attract more public. So they renewed it with for the typical manga cover. But if you look at it closely, you see the cord behind this woman. So this means that this woman is an AI robot, and she is so obedient and sweeps the floor, and she looks also nice, and she even reads a book. But this cover raised a sensation, and also women, mostly women, got angry about this very prejudiced image about women. And the journal editors apologized for their mishaps, and they also even held the conference saying that they need to reflect about the image of the women. However, in the later years, they also kept issuing these journals with many of the covers put women. Many covers are also women's pictures. So we wonder whether they reflected enough about their prejudiced women's image. And also people problematize about labor and the AI. So, for example, this was also became an issue about Amazon reportedly scraps internal AI recruiting tool that was biased against women. And it is also said that Japanese women are 3 times more likely to lose the job than men in the age of AI. This is because I think you can assume that Japanese women are still doing quite simple jobs compared with men. Japanese women do not assume professional positions, so that's why they are more likely to be replaced by the AI. Now another so to say, the theme was that this AI image, how they use the AI actually, what kind of interface we have in the everyday lives. And this is also another news when new JR station, Takanawa Gateway, introduced the AI information computer on the site. And on that computer, of course, this woman was on the screen and she gave us information, but she also answers questions like whether she was married or what kind, what are your 3 sizes, which means the body size, or and she also responds to the comments that she looks pretty and so on. So, and feminists also in Japan got very angry, but these happenings go on and on even afterwards. And but this is not the so to say the isolated case in the Japanese public. If you come to Japan on the street or anywhere, you see these women characters quite much, and these are, for example, these are the examples of women used for the public advertisements. The left picture is used by the Red Cross for the blood donation, and the second one is for the crime. This is used by the police, and the third is from the municipal advertisement by the city Shima, which is famous for the beautiful coastline, and they have these women getting shells with they called ama. They are professional sea divers. So these are the public image that they use to appeal the public. Now, so in a culture where women images are used in the public, a very biased or gender stereotype image are used in the public, and then the AI is used. AI is also taken as very positively. We have to be very careful that AI learn automatically such a prejudiced image of women. So some efforts are made to prevent that AI algorithm lead us to a wrongful gender biased society. For example, as the Japanese Society for Artificial Intelligence, as I mentioned before, they also, even they, they kept publishing journals with a stereotyped women image, but they held, for example, a symposium in 2021, and with the themes like career paths to the IT industry at women's universities, or they also shared realities of female researchers, and they also even held panel discussion about problems arising from the low diversity or work-life balance for both men and women, and what is the diversity that leads to the new innovations and things like that. Also, the government also endeavors to avoid prejudiced image of women directly go into the AI technologies. So, for example, they have this, the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communication released the guidelines in 2017 and 2019. And especially in the 2019, they have these basic philosophies and also the 10 principles about the AI utilization principles. And about the basic philosophies, and they include the diversity and inclusion as a phrase, and says that respect the diversity of people utilizing AI and include people with diverse backgrounds and values and ideas. And also among 10 utilization principles, they also include the word fairness. And the attention to unfair discrimination by learning algorithm, AI service providers and business users are expected to pay attention to the possibility of bias inherent in AI judgments due to the algorithms used in it. In machine learning in particular, trends among majorities tend to be adopted and minorities remain unnoticed or ignored. So they are aware of the problems of biased data that is fed to the AI and algorithms used in it. And besides that, these principles by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, also the Gender Equity Bureau in the Cabinet Office issued another basic plan for gender equality. And in that, they also include the phrase responding to the digital society. And here, for example, we can see the phrase like the disadvantages of AI need to be considered. In particular, both developers and users need to be aware that accumulated data and algorithms may contain biases. And here also they encourage young female researchers and female students to choose science and technology careers. So in this basic plan for gender equality by the Cabinet Office, they are also aware about for example, the crisis or in the digital age, that disadvantages of AI should be considered in academia. But in reality, it's been really hard. Also, as somebody from the University of Tokyo, which is a very male-dominated university, in the engineering faculty, as you see here in the master's course of the engineering faculty, women take up just about 10% or 15% among the entire master courses, and in the doctor courses, in the doctor course, it only take up about 10%. Women only take up 10%, and in the information science, it's even worse. Women take up very small portion in the entire graduate school. So we have a long way to go. But this is not only Japan, also in elsewhere. And if you see these figures in the, so to say, GAFA or Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, employees in technical roles male dominated in these sectors. So women are always, has been always the minority in the technology industry, as well as engineering and information science faculties. So, and there, inevitably, some biased image of women are produced and reproduced. And government has been, even Japanese government has been making efforts against it, but it's been not enough, and it's been not it's not been strong enough. And these efforts have also their limitations. As I show you, they mention about the principles of fairness or equality, but gender perspectives, especially in Japan, are quite lacking. And also, people talk about the increase of the number of women in the technology sector, both in the university or in the industry. But it is difficult, and also it is not a panacea. The discussion on gender equality have been limited to increasing, is mostly limited to increasing the number of women in the field of science and technology, but the masculinity embedded in the technology itself cannot be entirely solved, even the number of women increases in the respective sector. So we can talk about it later, about the embedded masculinity in the technology, but what I want to say is that only the number, headcount is not the panacea to solve this gender biased data. And also, AI does not exist in the vacuum. That's what our conclusion is, that the reason why AI has bias is because human has bias. And in order to create a bias-free AI, we need to create a bias-free and equal society at the same time, which is quite difficult. So, but we should not give up. So that's why we need to challenge, we decided to challenge these issues. And now I want to introduce a little bit about what we have done so far for the rest of my presentation. I have organized this BAI Global.
Sorry,
yeah.
Could you be a bit briefer? It's still okay.
I think we have 2 minutes. That's what.
Yes, no problem.
Yeah.
Just in general.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So BAI Global Forum is what I've been doing. We are doing research on before AI and behind AI and beneath AI. And we have held workshops at the university about AI and gender. And also we've been doing research on the collaborative project on gender and research. And also we do also check the media bias in the so-called Project Media and Diversity Forum. So these are some of what we have been doing so far in a project at the BAI Global Forum. Maybe I can talk a little bit later about what would have been done in the last year. But I think I can stop. I stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We will then come back to it in the discussion. Our next speaker is Melike ŞAHINOL from the Orient Institute, Istanbul, which is actually one of our sister institutes inside of the Max Weber Foundation. At the Orient Institute, Melike is Senior Research Fellow and head of the research area Human Medicine and Society. Its focus is on the interdependencies of medical innovations body practices and institutions, and corporeality of cyborgs from a social science and technology studies perspective. The talk today is on the digital cultures of health. Melike, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm just sharing my screen now. Just a moment. Okay. So it's a really great pleasure to be here, and for also inviting me. And I think that we have, even if the talks are diverse, we have very much in common. So this presentation addresses transformation processes in healthcare that run parallel to digitalization processes using biomedicalization as a framework, with special attention being paid to human enhancement technologies. And I will try to show some examples in between, and would then like to discuss also how digital transformation in healthcare has led to empowerment and what new challenges arise. Today, due to the advancements in science, technology, and medicine, medicalization has expanded into wider terrains, including people's everyday lives. And this emerging medical landscapes is conceptualized as biomedicalization. And it has 5 key interactive processes, as Clark et al. Described them. Which is first a new biopolitical economy of medicine, health, illness, living and dying, which forms an increasingly dense and elaborate arena in which biomedical knowledge, technologies, services are ever more co-constituted. And the second refers to a new and intensifying focus on health, on optimization and enhancement, and on the elaboration of risk and surveillance at very different levels, individual, niche groups, population levels. And then the techno-scientization of biomedical practices, where interventions for treatment and enhancement are progressively more reliant on science and technologies, and conceived in those very terms, and are ever more promptly applied, so the authors. And the fourth process is with regards to transformations of biomedical knowledge production, information management, distribution, and consumption. And the fourth and more interesting for me is the transformation of bodies and subjectivities. So that is why I will also concentrate more on the fifth process somehow, and give examples also with regards to connected to digital health. So first, let me clarify that human enhancement involves the use of technological means to improve or enhance people's physical or mental capabilities. And there are, for instance, existing technologies and also emerging human enhancement technologies. Just to name a few examples, there are physical enhancements like cosmetic surgery, or functional enhancers like prosthetics and exoskeletons, medical and organ replacements, etc. And for instance, 3D bioprinting and human genetic engineering belong, for instance, to emerging technologies. It is often stated that the use of technology in healthcare would not be human enhancement technologies, as these methods would be applied to healthy individuals. But I would somehow disagree with the statement with reference to the medicalization process and biomedicalization processes mentioned earlier. So not only because many technologies developed for people with certain diseases are used by healthy people, but also because human enhancement technologies create opportunities beyond the normal for people with disabilities, for instance. So a well-known example is James Young, whose bionic prosthesis arm includes a laser pointer, a flashlight, a USB port, and a drone. Here, for instance, you can see James Young in different positions and pictures. He is wearing a bionic arm prosthesis with a thread, and on the right edge of the picture, you can see the a lateral photo of him with a control unit attached to his mouth, wearing virtual reality glasses. And behind him, you can see that there is a thread. And then the photo suggests also that he is controlling the drone with his control device. And the glasses help him to see things the drone picks up around. So the bionic prosthesis also has an LED that can flash parallel with James' heartbeat and also send this data around in the possible future. And he has also an USB plug and a flashlight. So the future somehow prosthesis is evolving into a high-tech body part that couples with the help of at least one information and communication medium, and thus extends the body boundary and its capability. And I should also mention that computers, I mean, mobile phones and internet can also be used to enhance cognitive efficiency. So they also belong to human enhancement technologies. And notable efforts in human augmentation are driven by interconnected Internet of Things devices, including, for instance, wearable electronics, which is also like in this example, for instance, the glasses he wears. And smartwatches also, which some of you might know very well, or smart textiles, personal drones, on-body and in-body nano networks. And this interconnectedness makes things more complicated, I would say. So the example of James Young may seem rather futuristic, since it is not every day that we encounter people who have such technical equipment, right? So, however, I would like to return to the aspect of digitalization in connection with health or enhancing human, as it is also interconnected with the picture you have seen beforehand. So, and then, you know, I already mentioned that there is a fine line between the two, between enhancing and medical treatment. And there are other difficulties associated with the increasing pressure on performance, which I will also address later. So the adoption of information and communication technologies in healthcare systems is, of course, not new, but social and cultural impacts of digitalization on health and well-being is emerging again and again, also with COVID-19 and apps for regulation as a new topic of discussion. So digitalization of paper-based health records led to remote accessibility, for instance, and lastly, health records expanded to mobile units, for instance. And so telecommunication and other virtual technology was the main driver of digital or electronic health. A closer look within the health sector, patient-caregivers relationship was also influenced by ICT as from the 2010s disruptive technologies emerged. And through very qualitative qualitative changes have been experienced for both the patients and their caregivers. And this phenomenon is discussed within the topic digital health, which includes, and I quote, the use of digitalized health information systems by employing wireless mobile digital devices and wearable, implanted or inserted biosensors to monitor health, well-being, and physical function, and engage in self-care of illness, chronic medical conditions, or disability, remotely conducting medical consultations via digital media, end of quote. It is also defined as, quote, the cultural transformation of how cultural transformation of how disruptive technologies that provide digital and objective data accessible to both caregivers and patients leads to an equal level doctor-patient relationship with shared decision-making and the democratization of care. As digital health empowers the democratization of care, some ethical considerations such as, for instance, access and protection of patients' health data occur. And in addition, the potential of big data about health and illness have had a major impact upon healthcare and public health policy and practice. And on this slide, you can see what digital health includes. There's a bunch of things, and e-health, m-health, health 2.0, or medicine 2.0 are all topics of digital health, which is an indicator, of course, of the transformation of traditional healthcare. So you see here public health surveillance, health informatics, where also AI plays also a crucial role, and so on and so forth. And here you can see some other digital health related examples, for example, health apps such as high blood pressure measurements, pulse measurements, but also evaluation calculators, pedometer, sleeping monitor, constant self-measurement, and the possibility of transmitting these data to the responsible doctor are just a few, for instance, health tracking examples. And these also are connected to health management systems, which you can see on the slide, for instance, health system disease management apps, or personal health records, mobile apps, and so on and so forth. This technology-driven development also has an impact on the body and lifestyle, which is modified by medical technology and increasingly merge also with technology. Particularly in the field of medicine, digitalization opens up opportunities and risks for society and the individual. Digitalization in medicine is highly relevant in terms of health policy for an efficient healthcare system. This is because large amounts of data are integrated, evaluated, and visualized in big data centers, which require resources, of course, in order to develop or, for example, have an economically efficient therapeutic approach, for instance, cancer research. But it's also important, I mean, to moderate, to govern it, for instance, in times of COVID-19, right? So, but of course, on the other side, patients also should benefit from these. On a more individual level, digital health technologies provide information to lay people regarding their own healthcare, of course, and help them to, and I quote, share their experiences of health and illness, training and educating healthcare professionals, helping people with chronic illnesses to engage in self-care, and encouraging others to engage in activities to promote their health and well-being and avoid illness, end of quote. So an innovative way for monitoring one's own health and illness, improving well-being and self-control leads to improving, or might lead to improving well-being and self-control. And thus for many patients, medical technologies have empowerment potentials in terms of self-control over their health and social health care needs. So these circumstances are also discussed controversially in society. While some see precise documentation as positive, others perceive vital monitoring as a compulsion to control and as an economization of life. And it is not yet possible to predict what effects self-tracking, for instance, will have on the everyday lives of patients, for example, and also for the professional medical handling of these data. And I will give you a short example of self-tracking and glucose monitoring of patients with type 1 diabetes, a research that I have conducted with my colleague Gülşah Başkavak. So CGM, continuous glucose monitoring systems, are one of the most used self-tracking devices for their benefits in the everyday lives of patients with diabetes. And with the help of sensors, these devices measure sugar levels in an interval of 5 minutes, running 24 hours a day through a thin needle inserted in the underskin layer of the patient's skin. And this way, patients are aware of how their glucose levels change throughout the day and night, and know when the need arises to regulate their glucose levels. So we showed with my colleague that CGM leads to a considerable comfort for the parents, for instance, in their role of caregivers, and for the children as care receivers, since they need to be constantly pricked in the finger or woken up at night by their parents in order to measure insulin levels and receive insulin injections. So, and these, of course, no longer then apply because of the CGM system. So we presented a more differentiated picture regarding the empowerment of care relationships, and pointed to an imbalance between social biotechnical care practices leads to a back and forth of empowerment and disempowerment. And in our concept of social biotechnical care complex, we point out that a holistic care approach is essential for digital self-tracking technology to empower the patient. And in body care, such as exercise and diet control, it is observed that a former self-control negligence can occur with the use of technology. And after all, the control of insulin levels is delegated to technology, and this has implications for the entire care cycle. And we showed that while adults, for instance, can keep themselves relatively more in control of a diet and aware of their body's needs to exercise, for instance, it has been observed that children experience disempowerment in these situations. As caregiving parents stated throughout the interviews, one of the biggest sources of stress for their children was the impaired metabolic control and weight gain, as they felt comfortable in eating how much and whatever they wanted. And then we concluded, that CGM carried the risk of viewing diabetes as a technologically solvable problem instead of considering the disease as a whole. And this is mainly due to CGM experiences creating confidence in technology while neglecting important dietary measures and exercises needed to be integrated into daily routines. I mean, we can see this trust in technology on really different layers of society. So I'm nearly at the end of my presentation, and I have questions for you. So on the one hand, we have body technology relationships that seem to enhance patients, which is still preconditioned, but this also means that on the other hand, the human body makes it possible to read, program, and thus control health data from the inside out. And I have also many other research on that. For instance, patients with chronic stroke using brain-computer interfaces, just to give an example of my dissertation thesis. So we could, of course, ask what kinds of content are created and shared by lay people via health apps connected to all the digital health issues that you have seen in the former slides, to healthcare providers, shared via Facebook. I mean, Kaori has mentioned the Facebook, people sharing on Facebook, health data sharing on Facebook and other social media platforms, and also how healthcare professionals are using then this data, but not only healthcare professionals, but also social media platforms like Facebook, and then, you know, more capitalist providers maybe, of whatever. So and then how and then what are the political dimensions and power relations inherent to use those technologies, and what about privacy, and how far will we go, and how far will the use of medical technology go, if it's also interconnected with other technologies and enhancing possibilities. So I will stop there by asking a lot of weird questions, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melike. So let's come to the last speaker. Our third and last speaker is Franz WALDENBERGER. He is the director of the German Institute for Japanese Studies, so many of you may already know him from other events. Franz is on leave from his professorship at Munich University. His research focuses on the Japanese economy, corporate governance, and international management. And today's talk concerns regulation in the context of dispersed and contested knowledge. Franz, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I think I cannot thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, because I put myself on the list as an organizer of this event, and I'd like to share my screens first, so I'd rather have to apologize maybe. Well, our topic today is governance in the digital age, and we heard two presentations that focused on very important social issues, one on gender, the other on the risks and opportunities associated with the digitalization of health. And both these issues, of course, raise the question on how, as a society, we can deal with these issues in a good way. Good, of course, needs to be explained. Regulation is one aspect of governance, basically state governance, and I want to discuss this aspect, this part of governance, in the context of dispersed and contested knowledge. And I added a subtitle the role of knowledge infrastructures, and that's actually the concept I would like to sell to you tonight. And I think it's a useful concept also when we discuss the issues raised by the two presenters before. Now I need to move on here. So the first, of course, talking about regulation, what do we mean, or what do we expect from regulation? What should and can we expect from regulation? Regulation, I mean here the rulemaking by the legislative and the rule implementation by regulatory authorities should serve the public good. That's a very general, very simple statement, but it doesn't have a general and simple answers. Can we really expect that regulation serves the public good? They are, first of all, conceptual issues, of course. What is the public good? That's a question that welfare economists and, of course, social philosophers have asked themselves for for maybe hundreds of years. I don't want to go into detail here. There are also analytical issues. What serves the public good best? What kind of rules should we implement? Even if we know what the public good is, there are still many ways to achieve it. And so we see that today with climate change. All governments want to achieve zero carbon or carbon neutrality in a few decades. They all agree on that. Fortunately now, most of them, but there's of course a lot of discussion going on how to achieve it. So in the following, I want to put these conceptual issues about what is the public good aside and want to ask, how can we be sure that policymakers and regulators, even if they have the best intentions, so even if they have a good idea, a good understanding of what the public good is, and they are not sort of pursuing their own self-interests. I know that's a very strong assumption. So even if regulators have the best intentions, how can we make sure that they apply the best knowledge available when they design or implement regulations? The problem here is with best knowledge is that this best knowledge, of course, has two qualities which make it very difficult to answer this question in a simple way. Of course, policymakers and regulators, like everybody of us, has only a limited capacity, limited stock of knowledge available. Normally, we have to consult experts, especially lawmakers who deal with very different areas. So, and when they go out and look for experts, of course, there are lots of experts around. So knowledge is dispersed because expertise is not something that one mind can acquire by itself, but we need to sort of, it's spread across many minds, and knowledge is also, of course, local. Social, political, cultural conditions, individual conditions, of course, are local. So there is no integrated body of knowledge that policymakers could consult. They have to look at, they confronted with dispersed knowledge. At the same time, knowledge is incomplete, it's uncertain, there are conflicting expert opinions, and these opinions are often tied to specific interests, like you want to believe or you think this is true because it serves your interests best. So knowledge is not only dispersed, it's also contested. I think this is the reality that policymakers and regulators are facing. And so we can narrow down my original question by saying, how do policymakers and regulators with best intentions cope with dispersed and contested knowledge? And the answer, well, it's not an answer, but the tool I would like to use to analyze or to approach this question, this problem, are knowledge infrastructures. What do I mean by knowledge infrastructures? Well, infrastructures are networks. They connect people, they connect things, they allow for mobility, for the access and the provision of resources. So infrastructures are vital to any society. And we can apply this concept of networks, connections, and mobility. We can apply it also to knowledge. Knowledge here in the broad sense of expertise and opinions as well. The elements of a regulatory knowledge base would comprise the knowledge base within the bureaucracy, within the regulatory body or the lawmaking body. Then, of course, public commissions, governments and ministries, they use public commissions and councils to solicit advice from experts. There are, of course, consultancies and think tanks around who provide knowledge. Even if not asked, they will participate in public discourses. They will approach policymakers. There are industry associations, company experts that engage in lobbying, influencing lawmaking processes, cooperating with regulatory bodies on a more or less regular basis, maybe. Then, of course, we have NGOs, we have social movements. If issues have a high social attention, or if it's about social issues, then we will also have sort of knowledge created and proposed, put into, supplied by NGOs and social movements. And last but not least, of course, research institutions and scholars. So depending on the issue, of course, the knowledge infrastructure, its composition will differ. But what I'm proposing is that this knowledge infrastructure, and I will give a few examples later, is a useful way to discuss the question of regulation. And the question with the concept of knowledge infrastructure can be further narrowed down now by asking what qualities do these knowledge infrastructures need to have so that policymakers and regulators, again, those with the best intentions, can best cope with dispersed and contested knowledge. Now, these are a few qualities. One could maybe go into further detail, but I think very generally, and this, I think the approach I'm proposing here, the advantage is that you can deal with it. It can already be useful if you use it on a very general level. So, of course, we would think that knowledge infrastructures should be representative. They should include knowledge. They should sort of reflect all the different voices there, all the stakeholders, their position, their interests, their knowledge should be reflected in this infrastructure. It should be inclusive in the way that all these different interests and voices have an equal and fair access to the policy making process and to regulators. And these infrastructures should, of course, also be responsive to changes, to new technologies, new issues, and new ideas. So it's not just a static concept, it's also a dynamic concept when I speak of knowledge infrastructures. We can evaluate knowledge infrastructures and their use, I think, with regard to three basic questions. When we look at the outcome, policy outcomes, regulatory outcomes, the traceability. On what knowledge is this decision based? Where does it come from? What knowledge sources do these decisions sort of use? And why? Accountability, why do they use these specific knowledge sources and not others? This should be something that would need to be explained. And then, of course, the performance, having taken a decision, having implemented a regulation, how have things evolved after with the regulation? Has the regulation actually performed well or bad? So it's more or less the monitoring of the outcomes later on. So that's basically the very general aspect. And now I want to apply this idea of knowledge infrastructures to three examples, three very broad examples. And the first example is Japanese energy policy. And here, the issue at hand related to knowledge infrastructures was breaking the knowledge monopoly of dominant industry players. We organized an event quite a few years ago, already 2015. We had invited two speakers, Thomas Kaori and Yasuyo Yamazaki. Thomas was representing the just newly founded Japan Renewable Energy Foundation, and Yasuo Yamazaki, he was actually running an asset management company and heavily investing in renewable energy. And the question we asked was, transforming Japan into an energy-rich country, what needs to be done? Japan has a lot of renewable energy sources, but it's hardly using them. And the question was what to do? And actually both speakers came up with almost the same answer. And they said, well, what needs to be done is we need to convince the Japanese public that renewable energy is actually feasible, it's cheap, and it's reliable. And these are all things that the general public in Japan is not knowing, and the policymakers are not knowing or ignoring because of the monopoly of dominant industry players who basically occupy the knowledge infrastructure in Japan in this area. So actually, Masayoshi Son of SoftBank, he founded this Japan Renewable Energy Foundation, which is now called Japan Renewable Energy Institute, as an independent, industry independent body, NGO, to offer advice and consulting on renewable energy. And after a few years, I think this institution has already made some inroads into Japanese policy making. Another example, the next example is finance, a field which I have also looked at when I studied Japanese finance, Japanese monetary policy. And here I think the issue with knowledge infrastructures is how to overcome the de facto self-regulation of an industry. Finance is incredibly important, and it has been regularly causing enormous trouble and costs on the economy and of course on the livelihood of many people, if we just think about the recurring financial crisis that we encounter. Now, the problem with the financial industry is that it's basically regulated the knowledge base which sort of feeds into the regulation, and the regulation of the industry is basically solely provided by the industry itself. There is hardly any independent knowledge used in the design of the financial system, especially when this knowledge runs counter the status quo interests. There are some issues that have been discussed in the scholarship among scholars over almost 100 years, equity requirements of banks, what monetary regimes are most stable. And these arguments from scholars have been largely ignored as they run counter sort of the status quo interest of the industry. I posited this cover of a book, The Banker's New Clothes, which argues for higher equity requirements for banks and gives a lot of reasons why it should be done, and explains the sort of the self-interest of the industry refusing these proposals. Monetary policy is also an issue. It's one of the most important aspects of our lives. Money, the money we are using, is actually governed by a policy regime which is hardly questioned. There is some transparency now, but there is hardly any accountability for what central banks are doing. So finance is another issue where we see some deficiencies, definitely deficiencies in the knowledge infrastructure. Now, of course, big data and AI here as well, that's a new field. And here the question of knowledge infrastructures is how to adequately respond to the rapid advances in the technology with a high disruptive potential. What can we do? How do these knowledge infrastructure, what kind of knowledge infrastructure is now developing? We see a lot of developments actually. We see independent think tanks here. I posted the Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, a German think tank that provides independent, not industry-funded research and knowledge to the general public. We have the responsible AI research team at the University of Freiburg, in Germany, which is also funded not by industry, but government bodies. The AI governance in Japan, an interim report published early this year by an expert group working, or this was commissioned by the Japanese Ministry of Economy. And of course, we have the European Commission, which with its regulation of data protection, which is now dominant, but of course still questionable whether it is useful. So here we see that already knowledge infrastructures are developing, but of course we have to be careful that they're not captured and controlled by industry interests solely. So let me conclude with two slides. One is, how can we assure that knowledge infrastructures are adequate? Of course, they have to differ according to the issue we are looking at. Well, there are many avenues to pursue. One, of course, is we need to start studying these knowledge infrastructures, issue related, and of course, digital health and gender are issues, as are AI and big data. We need independent knowledge production. This can only be, of course, achieved if there is funding for independent knowledge production. That could be at universities, but also at independent think tanks. We need reporting, auditing, evaluation requirements to make knowledge more transparent, more accessible. Of course, we can ask the role of education, the role of the social sciences and humanities in knowledge infrastructures or for knowledge infrastructures, the role of the media, as Kaori pointed out. In the case of gender, I think it plays a very important role, but not only there. The potential then of the digital transformation to improve knowledge infrastructures, of course, is also an aspect to look at. So I think it's a very broad, very useful and promising field or concept, and it's not only the knowledge infrastructures that really exist. I think what I would want to sell here is also knowledge infrastructures as an analytical framework, because it allows us to analyze regulation by taking the dispersed and contested nature of knowledge seriously. Normally, when you talk about regulation, you do as if there was only one body of knowledge, and you normally take position with one side. So the framework of knowledge infrastructures allows us to assess the quality of regulation and the regulatory processes without getting trapped in the web of contested knowledge. So we move one level above on a meta level and look at what kind of knowledge is there, and is the knowledge adequately represented, and does it have adequate access to decision makers. Of course, our knowledge about knowledge infrastructures will as well be incomplete and biased. We cannot avoid the need to make judgments, but the quality of such judgments can be assessed without being an expert of the issue itself. I think that respective discussions should therefore be better accessible also by the general public and by the media. And with this note, I want to finish. There's a short opinion paper that I was able to position in a G7 magazine. If you're interested, here's also the link. And thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Franz, for the contribution. Good. So let's first have an exchange among the speakers, what you detected in the other's speech, what you find interesting bringing up. Kaori, do you want to start?
Well, thank you very much. They were very interesting, although our speeches were quite diverse, dealt with diverse topics. I think we have many things in common in terms of governance and in terms of the infrastructure and knowledge-based governance. So My question would be first to Melike, that you talked about health issues and diagnosis and medication and so on. And from my gender perspective, we've been always talking about that accumulating health data for AI in the age of AI. It is tendentiously that data of men's bodies are dominated in the world of health and medicine. And inevitably, if we pursue health with technologies, the whole medication and will be skewed to male bodies. And how, it's not a joke.
No, I'm happy that you
and
raised
but if we know that, it's okay. But how can we govern or overcome this innate masculinities within our society, as well as within the technologies? That's my question to Melike.
Oh, that's a very good question. You know, actually, I'm very happy that you raised this issue, because, you know, it is still like that medicine seems to still disadvantage certain gender groups in health issues. And there is a really good article I would like to recommend in The Guardian, showing how male bias in medical trials ruined women's health, and ruined, I mean really ruined, and there in the article you can find also different examples of scientists and researchers, mostly been men, and also most of the cells and animals and humans studied in medical science have also been male. And so most of the advantages have in medicine have come from studies of male biology. So, and then, you know, you have mentioned embedded masculinity in technology. I mean, and this is not only technology, this is also health. And we really have to ask ourselves, how can we disrupt, how can we crash this male system of health, I would say. So yeah, I mean, definitely very important question. And I think, well, one aspect might be, you know, to stick your finger into the wound, and then you know, do research on queer medicalization processes, and post-human studies. Science and technology studies are, you know, always looking at these things, how science is made, how technology is made, what kind of you know, social perspectives, cultural perspectives are embedded into science and technology. And I mean, this is a really good way in order to show that there is a lack, and there is, I mean, medicine seems not only to disadvantage certain groups, it disadvantages certain groups, and we can only, you know, solve these kind of problems if we do, of course, research on these kind of things, if we get funds for this kind of research also, you know, that I mean, it's not yeah, everybody knows that it's research funds are yeah, the research fund, we rely on these, but it is very hard to then get research funds, for instance, for queer medicalization processes, you know, And we
and
also have
in this, if I may connect,
yeah.
Not only men or sexuality, but also white, non-white. There's also a business, a bias in there, and then taking up post-human aspect, general situated knowledge, the idea of situated knowledge that you, in general, you perceive very differently from person to person, and you act very differently. And this is not only, and calling this local could be a bit vague, a bit homogenizing, too homogenizing, and this goes in the direction of Franz, and probably gives a good connection.
Did I say local? I don't think so, because I mean, I'm very aware of situated knowledge concept, and I mean, as an STS scholar, I'm very aware of these kind of things, but I don't know how the participants here in this panel are up to. I mean,
this is something like Franz, who building the infrastructure and for decision making. This is a classical problem of the sociology of scientific knowledge, and you probably can react well to the other ones, the problems raised there. What do you think?
I don't know if I understand correctly, but with regards to the knowledge landscapes, I mean, we also have to somehow look at transparency and data protection, right? I mean, Franz clearly stated that quality of data is also crucial. I mean, and it's very important, I guess. And looking at the quality of data is really very important, yeah? But for instance, we should of course think of transparency and data protection, and in specific countries, and then also conduct comparative studies, I would say. And then, you know, you can see different layers of social situatedness, cultural situatedness, knowledge, you know, layers by layers, and then and you can see a tiny of the whole picture, a tiny aspect of the whole picture. And I described, for instance, that a bit in one of my articles with regards to e-health knowledge landscapes. For instance, I compared Turkey and Germany. Mm-hmm. And when you see, for instance, health data scandals in Turkey combined with a high number of users of government-provided health technologies are important indicators, for instance, for technology-friendly society with low awareness, you know, of data protection, but also low digital literacy, just to give a very small example. And then, you know, historical and socio-technical differences in the use of health technologies in Turkey and Germany can also be illustrated in different techno-political scenarios, for instance, about the future also. I mean, we have papers with regards of Vision 2023, the 100th years anniversary of Turkey, where you can all see this kind of things. So, for instance, in Germany, there is technophobia is somehow predominant feature of German society, I would say, and this also has historical roots. I mean, I'm not a historian, but I can say this, very clearly. So,
for moderation aspects, so the audience can already type something in the chat. We now go to Franz, but to the reaction. But in order to then go right into the discussion, you can already put something in there, but you can also listen to the rest.
Well, I think for what Kaori presented is clearly, I mean, this BAI activity is clearly, of course, a contribution trying to change the knowledge infrastructure related to the gender issue in Japan. Similar, so it's an independent body of knowledge, and the question, of course, is then the next issue is how to get access to policymakers. The role of the media, I would be interested to hear what, I mean, Kaori, you have a lot to say certainly about the role of the media in the. We don't think of the media of creating knowledge, but of course they do in a way form and shape. They filter, they transport. They are sort of, in a way, a very essential element in the infrastructure, what the mobility and accessibility of knowledge means. I mean, that's certainly something. So the concept of knowledge infrastructure would be able to implement, to include media, the role of media to some extent. And of course, the digital health is like AI and big data. It's a new evolving field with lots of. It's probably not a single issue. It has many issues attached to it. And here again, I think we, from my perspective, it would be interesting to see how knowledge infrastructures develop with regard to this. And of course, science technology studies are an important source of knowledge, of non-sort of technological, non-technocratic knowledge, contributing to the knowledge infrastructures in this field. So I think it's important that the social sciences and humanities contribute to these technology-dominated fields and offer different perspectives. That would be my take on my connection with the other two presenters. Thank you.
Yeah, what I personally fear a bit is,
maybe Kaori can say something, because I mentioned the media. So
please. Still no question. So
yes, I think media is also part of the infrastructure, knowledge infrastructure, and also they also create knowledge, even though, I mean, if you define knowledge as something like news and, information, and media contribute to that part quite much, maybe one of the main body of the infrastructure. But I have a question to Franz. The concept of infrastructure, we have so far understood infrastructure something as roads or water, sewage, and gas, and so on. And nowadays, people all talk about infrastructure, knowledge infrastructure, or GAFA dominate the infrastructure of knowledge and so on. But do you think that the concept, infrastructure itself has changed quite much? If you compare it from, for example, 100 years ago, and whether it is appropriate to term these GAFA platforms as infrastructure that made us, so to say, inevitable from using these platforms, make us also see them as infrastructure. And that is also, there's also some kind of dark side of it. I mean, they are invisible anyway, and not transparent enough, and so on. And they also that make them, give them, so to say, justification of why they can stay invisible and they can stay so powerful and so on. So sometimes I question myself whether I can use the word infrastructure for them.
Yeah, well, of course, infrastructure, we all think of something very vital, very important, something we cannot do without. In a way, if we want or not, I think we hardly, of course, I can perfectly do without Facebook. I'm not on Facebook, although maybe they have an account which I'm not using, but but the but of course I use other platforms as I like for convenience. I think of course the term infrastructure becomes, it always has a material or physical aspect, but there's also the virtual aspect, virtual infrastructures, immaterial infrastructures. And I think to understand, because regulation or governance, that's all related to knowledge. Of course, it's also related, technology itself, of course, is knowledge. And so the knowledge embedded in a technology, we can also question, we can also ask, what is the knowledge infrastructure underlying a certain technology? And as you mentioned, masculinity. No? So I would argue then, of course, to really tackle this issue, you have to make the knowledge infrastructure underlying the technology more female, or more, you have to bring in more sort of female perspectives, women perspectives into this infrastructure. And that might be, and then you think, okay, how can you do it? Media, education, of course, also the numbers, you know, more women in the field. But I think that approaching it from this sort of knowledge base or knowledge infrastructure perspective, we find a way to tackle things, not only to analyze deficiencies, but also maybe to offer. It's not simple, because, I mean, how can we gain attention and so on? But we maybe see a viable way to change or influence things.
Okay.
And if I may add, not only women, but also, Kaori, but also diverse, diverse groups, as was already also mentioned. There are not only white men who can program, you know, apps and so on and so forth. So, and it is also important to involve other groups, other vulnerable, so-called vulnerable groups, for instance, also people with disabilities. I mean, if you see this panel is not accessible enough. Yeah, people with hearing disabilities, people with seeing disabilities cannot really access this panel, for instance. So we have to be really aware of, you know, of all these tiny things, and include more diverse people, so to say, in order to have, you know, similar rights, or, you know, to not exclude others. So yeah. More to have a more inclusive society, so to say.
Adding on this and opening up the field a bit, it is also not accessible for people who cannot speak English in a trivial way, right? Let's say it like this. And now a bit to the technical side, this self-enforcing and bias and so on. If we speak about deep learning algorithms, you don't understand how they enforce each other. So you can say, well, okay, let's put away the male-female bias. Let's put away the bias regarding gender, but other biases could come in a way that you don't even imagine it. The algorithm could become skewed in a really in a way that is really not wanted. And then it's always whether a group can mobilize enough resources to be covered in this equality regime. I think that's a property of algorithms that rely on deep learning instead of explainability, because you don't, Google is bad at explaining why it comes up with the results it comes up with.
Yeah, well, I think that's a big issue, of course, on how to govern black boxes, which are designed to be black boxes. So I think it needs a lot of how would I say, of course, we need to be aware of the issue, and also those people who are developing these black boxes, they should understand, or they need to understand that it should be in their own interest to make sure that there are no strong biases. I mean, I think Kaori, you brought the example of Amazon, who started this recruitment AI program, and then noticed that it's not working as it was supposed to work. I mean, that's a good case of self-control and self-monitoring. And I think we need to think about more ways to implement this kind of self-control or self-monitoring into these black box or around these black box how do you say, black box tools. Yeah. Maybe there was another aspect that I think when you corrected my unscientific word local knowledge by saying, well, actually local knowledge is an economist's term, which was introduced by Hayek. He talks about local knowledge, but of course, maybe in a broader sense, one can talk about situated knowledge, which is of course what local knowledge means, but not understood well enough. Now, situated knowledge, I think in this respect, I gave the example Japanese energy policy, where interestingly, a new sort of independent think tank was established to break the knowledge monopoly of existing incumbent companies. And this think tank was explicitly drawing from foreign knowledge. So from experiences of European countries, experience the energy transition of in European countries, to bring this knowledge to Japan, into the energy policy making of Japan. And I'm wondering whether this kind of, a transfer, of course, often it's also an instrument, it's of course an instrumentalization of foreign experiences to influence and change policy making. I was wondering whether this is relevant, could be relevant for gender issues in Japan. I mean, to what extent do people who promote gender issues, to what extent do they rely actually on foreign knowledge and try to sort of transfer this into the discussion, into the discourse, the Japanese discourse? Maybe Kaori, maybe you have some. You know that. You of course have the German experience as a background as well, not only, but also.
I think if you want to transfer foreign knowledge to other cultures, the culture that receives the foreign knowledge should be willing to accept that, and also willing to change. And overall, in my opinion, the Japanese society, it has not yet realized enough. Well, it's been changing quite much, but has not realized yet why, for example, gender issues are so important to, for example, innovations, or even for economy or politics and so on. So I think we in the age of digitization and information, we can get all kinds of knowledge and all kinds of information from everywhere. And we have so many chances. We can also travel. Well, under pandemic, not so much, but we could travel so much. But we still have cultures independently. For example, we have German culture, Japanese culture, Turkish culture. They overlap each other, and they are also converging. But nevertheless, the core is still there. And how do we think what is the core of our culture. And I think in the Japanese culture, there's still a very, so to say, gendered image of what the core is about Japanese culture. The core culture is something very, for example, is against gender equity in a way. If you see, for example, the news about Mako's marriage at the moment, the Princess Mako was so, her marriage was so opposed by the public because of her free, so to say, decision to marry common and try to pursue her own will, which is forbidden by in the imperial tradition. That's kind of the typical misogynic attitude about women, but we don't call it a misogyny. So yeah, I mean, the transfer of gender knowledge is quite important, and we do have quite many institutions of gender equity in Japan. We incorporate lots of women's rights here in Japan, but it is not about the institution, but it is about the culture. So, and people don't utilize these many institutions already exist, already present in our society. So yeah, it's not only about knowledge transfer, but it's more to do with culture, history, and the situated knowledge, as Melike said, and will, and also emotion, affection, and so on. It's not only that rational choice. That's how always I've been said. Politics does not move around rational choice, but it's always been led by public emotion, affect, and so on. So, yeah. So that's important. That poses me another question about what knowledge infrastructure means, whether it is incorporated in, whether the emotion and affect is also incorporated into the infrastructure, what you said, what you mean by infrastructure or culture and all those aspects. How do you interpret these as something that you call infrastructure?
Yeah, of course, it depends on the issue, but many issues are very emotional. And then, of course, then the infrastructure also has strong emotional elements. No? If you talk about immigration policy, for example, of course, you will, the infrastructure knowledge. So therefore, knowledge for me is not just scientific knowledge, it's what people believe. Yeah, what people believe to be true and useful and so on. So it's not a scientific concept of knowledge, but everything that sort of, yeah, people think that this is relevant and this is important, and this should be reflected when we regulate certain areas, certain issues. No? So, and then some issues become very emotional, like immigration, or also gender, of course, and some issues might be very technocratic, and we just need to know about, you know, scientific, even the scientific knowledge might be divided. In the pandemic, for example, of course, we also have the issue of freedom and to what extent do we restrict our mobility and so on. But on the other hand, I think the issue was very much dominated in some countries more, in some less, by scholars, yeah, by scholarly knowledge. So it depends on the issue, but of course, emotions are an important part of what I understand as knowledge infrastructure. Yeah.
Regarding this, can I say something? You don't want infrastructure to break down, but if you identify parts in the decision structure as not well through a political process, how would this change the so-called knowledge infrastructure? It would then not be an infrastructure anymore, I think, because actually it's a bit of a critic, a bit of a blasé statement, but gender management could also be something technocratic to go towards a better society. But on the other hand, there are issues that are globally contested. Global South, Global North. The Global South has for a long time heard about the Global North bringing its arguments in a way that is seemingly objective, but which is in fact not accepted by them for better or worse reasons. What is the political play in this field?
It is, of course, political. I mean, especially because I'm talking about regulation, and so there are interests, clashing interests, different stakeholders involved, and so to analyze or to assess whether we can expect good outcomes is to check whether the quality of the infrastructure. And the example I gave for finance, I would say, I mean, we see these recurring financial crisis, and of course the financial industry saying us, well, this is inherent in the system, we cannot change it, it's just there, and that's the way they protect themselves from any outside knowledge, sort of any changes to the design of the system, which would sort of change their interests or conflict with their interests. There have been lots of suggestions, but they've just been more or less ignored as not feasible, as as unrealistic. But it's an industry that is regulated based on the knowledge of the industry, and there is no independent knowledge base. Maybe digitalization is breaking it up in a little bit, because there are new technologies entering now the financial industry that might change, but this is certainly a case where it's also very difficult, of course, to change the situation, but to be aware of the issue, I think, is a first step.
Just adding something, everybody can react. A personal message came from me from Dylan Scudder, who has already left, but nevertheless who thanks for the talk, and says that evaluating the legitimacy of stakeholder goals would be difficult. That's what we're talking about, but that independent think tanks could specify criteria for evaluating such infrastructures. Now, independent is also something almost formal, but yeah, what do you three think about independent, about the word independent? Kaori, perhaps?
So you mean by
independent think tanks assessing problems regarding knowledge infrastructure?
Whether it is possible or not.
Yeah.
Is that your question?
Yeah, well,
it's not only the digital age, it's been always the problem. Also the controlling the media.
Yeah.
And whether the independent body, who would designate the members of the independent bodies, for example, and who finances it, and how, but the biggest part is how would you designate the members? Whether you, if, for example, in the German, many of the German cases, you would choose people from different social bodies and groups. But in Japan, you would choose experts. That's how it works. Often it works, especially in the public broadcasting system. In Germany, you would choose from the diverse social bodies, people, representatives of the diverse social bodies. Whereas in Japan, you would choose the so-called chishikijin, experts. But who would define experts? And the question goes on and on and on, and very often the final answer is the parliament, because people would say that parliament is chosen by the people, but often parliament is dominated by political parties. So often it has so if you say the independent bodies, it has often a very political influence. I think political scientists know this, so it is difficult, yeah. but people try. I mean, we can control it. I mean, I want to be optimistic about that, being try to always find a way to control something by an independent body. Otherwise, you can't really do anything.
Yeah.
Also, the universities, for example, I got my money from my BAI project by the SoftBank. And people would say, oh, you get money from SoftBank, so you should be always good for the SoftBank. But we are independent. I would say we are independent, and we are independent. But the people cast doubtful eyes on us, and we have to prove it. And there are many cases like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
No problem. Franz, Melike, who of you wants to say something to independent, almost about, well, yeah, a formal word, a word that screams to be filled with content?
Well, there is no, well, of course, it's also relative. I mean, you have to define it situationally. I think you cannot define it generally. And there are degrees of independence. And I think the funding criteria would be one. Then, of course, the personal affiliations and other things would be others. I mean, there's this big discussion about the so-called independent directors on Japanese, on boards of directors. What is independence? It has been redefined over the years, be made more strict. Of course, they are, yeah, the question is then, in the end, extreme independence would also mean indifference. No? So people who are completely independent might also be indifferent, and they might not engage as much as those who are more or less independent. So there's always also a little trade-off. At least that's what I see from the corporate governance discussion of independence, of independent directors on boards of companies. No?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy question because you always act within a framework. And this is really very preconditional. I mean, it's not only the funding. I'm just remembering the HIY networks coming together and supporting somehow, and funding also research on their own, and you know, and this led then to new possibilities for people with HIV, positively tested with HIV, and so on and so forth. But this, of course, is not only situated, but has also, of course, is its yeah, techno-political frameworks. Yeah, we shouldn't. Yeah, we shouldn't underestimate this, I guess. So independent is really a very difficult word. I mean, you are independent somehow in tracking your health with your mobile phone or with your Apple iWatch. But what I have mentioned, if you are not aware of digital literacy, of where your data goes and so on and so forth, then you get other problems, you know. So, and then of course, yeah, the word independent is also on a shaky ground. So yeah, as I'm not a philosopher, I would say I should be very careful, you know, in yeah, somehow answering the independence question with regards to technology.
Well, yeah, I mean, today's topic is governance, and yeah, independence screams to be filled with content. And this is, it's not a problem that we don't arrive at a final formally correct answer. There's no such thing. Yes, Franz?
Yeah, I would like to ask Melike about, she is very active within the social technology studies field. And I think that's a very intriguing I don't know so much about it. We also have a researcher at our institute involved in social technology studies. And what is the motivation? I mean, a lot of our life, of course, is influenced by technology, and we see with digitalization in the digital age that technology becomes more and more dominant, and we cannot just leave everything to the technology side. No? I mean, we need to counter it, we need to reflect it. So how do you think STS, what's the role of STS in this field? I mean, it's not just research. I think it's also engaging with policy, or how do you position STS?
Oh, this is a really different question, because it's so broad, you know. We know that, I mean, STS fellows are somehow also, yeah, I mean, they are looking at the interdependencies of science, technology, and society. And for instance, there have been the laboratory studies showing that knowledge is never objective as we think about knowledge, because someone said beforehand that there might be objective knowledge or so, and you know, and the lab studies have shown, you know, that that knowledge is social constructed and so on and so forth. So this came from somehow the interrelations of sociology of knowledge, and then philosophy of knowledge, philosophy of technology, and then rooted into broader STS studies. But of course, I mean, it's important to look at the interdependencies of society, politics, culture, and how scientific knowledge is, you know, constructed, and how innovations and technologies are constructed. And then, you know, we have a lot of tendencies towards post-human studies, or studies that that also look on the material side of life, not only focusing on humans as the center of the world. I mean, in order to answer, difficult questions like, what is it about climate change, or what is it about a virus intervening in humans' lives and then shaping humans' lives, and so on and so forth. So it is not coming from out there. It is somehow social constructed, and STS fellows are showing this all the time. I mean, we see a lot of the article which I have posted in the chat, for instance, also is somehow also an STS view. Or Bruno Latour has written a lot about climate change and how we have never been modern. So, you know, to quote his very famous book. So yeah, it is a broad question. So I don't think that we should only focus on human, and then, you know, only focus on one tiny thing, but also but have these comparative studies also with regards of AI. I mean, the world is small, right? So AI is not only happening in Japan or in Germany or so. It is crossing borders, so to say, like the virus crossing borders. So Franz, you have mentioned in our conversation beforehand that we have to look also on nationalities, and that we have to govern on somehow on the national side of the game somehow. But you know, but I mean, the virus shows us that this is not possible anymore, that we have to talk with each other, right? Because I mean, you cannot govern a virus so easily, you know, or you cannot govern the widespread of the disease so easily if you only stick to national governance somehow. So yeah, I don't know if I have answered your question, but I tried to at least.
Something is coming in the chat regarding this, but before that, just a point about what is STS. Well, knowledge is indeed socially constructed, but Bruno Latour, who was working in this field, in the end, or nowadays says that he has, because there was so much emphasis on social construction, now climate change is brought up as a total human construction by people who take the once debated point still and overuse it in a sense. So I think not all knowledge is equal. That's kind of one aspect to take into account. But in the chat, there was a comment, which I now read: independence and expertise together with participation of a broad community makes life even more complicated than it is presently. The discussion is very interesting, but I believe more likely experts than option-driven groups or people. Independence, expertise. Do you have to take into account scientists more than journalists and so on? This is a topic of an aspect to address in knowledge infrastructures, I think. What do you think, Franz?
Well, I could not clearly get the main point. I'm not sure whether I got the main point of the comment, but as I said in the end, of course, analyzing, looking at knowledge infrastructures, we also face the problem of sort of contested knowledge. I mean, the thing is, I try to find a pragmatic way to cope with the issue without ignoring it. We normally, when we discuss regulation, we ignore the difficulties and then we come up with nice statements and nice solutions just for the sake of the argument. But if we take the reality seriously and try to actually address the issue of dispersed and contested knowledge, and the issue that policymaking confronts, I think that a pragmatic way looking at knowledge infrastructures, it's not a solution, it's just a framework to approach the topic without being trapped, you know, having to take side for one argument or the other, but just looking at analyzing the process on this from this higher perspective, I think can help us get see deficiencies and maybe see also where things could be improved, which doesn't mean that we can actually improve them. That's again a way of how we can influence the political process. But the first thing is awareness and making a concrete argument where to start. And for that purpose, I feel that that this concept of knowledge infrastructures might be useful. It will not solve all the issues. I mean, there's a lot of lobbying, political activity, and other things needed. Yeah.
So, thank you very much for the speakers. We are slowly running out of time, and yeah. We have more events in this series, Digital Transformation. Next week, there will be none. In general, it's a weekly rhythm, but next week, there's no event. On October 14th, we have an event on data infrastructures and open science with 3 speakers, Mio Funamori, who is here today, Jeroen Sondervan, and Helmut Trischler. And it would be nice if you have time and then come again. We will advertise it over the channels in time. And yeah, thank you very much for coming and for listening. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
See you again. Bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.